On a crystalline day in August of 2020, a devoted father and his baby daughter walked into the ancient, labyrinthine wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains Hazel Creek area and were swallowed whole. Eli and Leah Walker, a teacher and his one-year-old child, vanished from a world of sunlight and well-marked trails into the deep, shaded silence of the forest, leaving behind nothing but a car in a parking lot and a final happy photograph. For days, the mountains were assaulted by the frantic noise of searching, the chop of helicopter blades and the shouts of men, but the wilderness offered no answers. A single grim clue, a small, chewed booty found in an area of heavy bear activity, gave birth to a horrifying and seemingly logical narrative, a fatal, random encounter with one of the park's wild inhabitants. For 5 years, this story calcified into tragic folklore, a cautionary tale that offered a brutal, if incomplete, form of closure. The mountains kept their silence. Then, in the late summer of 2025, that silence was broken. 2 university students, exploring an unmarked ridge far from any trail, stumbled upon a bear's den. Inside, amidst the bones and detritus, lay a flash of synthetic color, a small backpack that had been missing for half a decade. Its discovery was not an end, but a beginning. It was a catalyst that reopened a cold case and sent it hurtling in a new and terrifying direction. Forensic science would soon reveal that the true monster in the woods that day had not been a bear, but a man. The backpack was not merely a relic of a tragic accident, but the first clue in a murder investigation, a thread that, when pulled, would unravel a story of greed, violence, and a secret hidden in the earth, finally bringing a terrible and long-awaited truth to light. The clock on the cabin's mantelpiece seemed to tick louder than a human heartbeat. 6:45 p.m., 45 minutes. Simone Walker ran a hand over the smooth, cool river stone of the fireplace, her mind a practiced machine of rationalization. 45 minutes was nothing in the Smokies. A missed turn on the drive back to the marina. A longer-than-expected chat with another hiker on the trail. A simple, delightful delay caused by a daughter fascinated with a caterpillar or a strangely shaped leaf. Her husband, Elijah, was methodical, a planner, a man who approached the wilderness with a teacher's patience and a deep, abiding respect. But even the most careful plan had margins, and 45 minutes was well within that acceptable buffer. He was a good hiker, familiar with these mountains, if not a seasoned backcountry survivalist. He was cautious. And with Leah, their 1-year-old daughter, his caution would be amplified to an almost paralytic degree. She walked to the window, peering out at the dense wall of trees that ringed the small rental property near Fontana Lake. The sun had already dipped below the jagged western ridge, and the sky was bleeding from a brilliant orange into a deep bruised purple. This was twilight, the magical hour that Eli loved. But for Simone, it was the hour of the wolf. The time when the woods stopped being a postcard and started becoming a place of shadows and secrets. She unlocked her phone for the dozenth time, her thumb swiping to the last message he'd sent, a small beacon of digital life from 11:15 that morning. The photo was so vivid it hurt to look at. Leah, nestled in the cocoon of her bright blue hiking carrier, was a riot of giggles, her face framed by the floppy brim of a white sun hat. Behind her, Eli's own smile was wide and genuine, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He was in his element. In the background, the vast, shimmering expanse of Fontana Lake was a sheet of hammered silver under the midday sun. The accompanying text was simple, suffused with the easy joy that had defined their trip. She loves it. The mountains are calling her name. Back by 6. Back by 6. The words were a promise, a contract written on the screen of her phone. Now, as the clock ticked past 7:30 p.m., that promise was beginning to feel like a lie. The machinery of rationalization began to seize up, its gears grinding with the grit of true fear. An hour and a half. This was no longer a margin of error. An hour and a half after dark, with a 1-year-old child, in a remote area like Hazel Creek, it was unthinkable. Eli would never. He carried 2 headlamps on every hike, even a short day trip. He packed enough snacks and water for a small army. He knew the rule. The first and most important rule was to be out of the woods before dusk, especially with a baby. The idea that he would have miscalculated his timing this badly was more alien to Simone than the thought of him sprouting wings and flying away. Her practiced calm, a skill she'd learned from him, began to fray. She thought of the route, Hazel Creek. It was one of the park's more remote areas, accessible primarily by a boat shuttle across Fontana Lake. It was beautiful, historic, and quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. He had been so excited, planning the trip for weeks, poring over maps of the old logging community, telling her stories of the families who had lived there before the park was created. It was to be a special trip, a father-daughter pilgrimage into the heart of the wilderness he so adored. A chance for him to whisper the names of the trees to Leah, to let her feel the texture of moss on a fallen log, to instill in her the same quiet reverence he felt. Now, that sacred space felt sinister. The mountains that were calling Leah's name had not returned her. At 8:15 p.m., the dread was a physical presence in the room, a cold weight in her stomach. She paced the length of the small cabin, from the stone fireplace to the window overlooking the encroaching darkness, a caged animal in a space that suddenly felt like a trap. Every sound from outside, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. A desperate, foolish hope that it was the crunch of his hiking boots on the gravel path. But each time, it was just the forest settling in for the night, indifferent to the storm raging inside her. She thought of his face in the photo, the pure, unadulterated happiness. She thought of Leah's giggle, a sound that was the entire score of her own life. The juxtaposition of that morning's joy with this evening's terror was a form of psychological torture. The what-ifs began their assault. A swarm of venomous insects, a twisted ankle, a sudden illness, getting turned around on an unmarked spur trail. But her mind kept circling back to the same implacable fact. Eli was prepared. For a twisted ankle, he had a first aid kit and trekking poles. For getting lost, he had a map, a compass, and a GPS app on his fully charged phone. What could have happened that would neutralize all of his meticulous preparations? What could silence an expert? The question hung in the still air of the cabin, unanswerable and terrifying. It suggested the intervention of something sudden, something overwhelming, something that gave no time for plans or backups. By 9:00 p.m., the time for hope and rationalization was over. The dread had solidified into a cold, hard certainty. Something was terribly wrong. Her hands, surprisingly steady, unlocked her phone one last time. She didn't look at the picture. She navigated to her recent calls and found the number she had saved when they checked in at the ranger station, a number she had prayed she would never need. Her finger hovered over the screen, the act of pressing the green button feeling like a surrender, an admission that the world she had woken up in that morning no longer existed. She was no longer the wife of a man on a hike. She was the wife of a missing person. She pressed the button. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "National Park Service dispatch, how can I help you?" Simone took a deep, shuddering breath, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. "My husband," she began, her voice cracking. "My husband and my baby daughter. They went for a hike today in Hazel Creek. They were supposed to be back 3 hours ago. They're not back." The words, once spoken aloud, became real, irrevocable. The silence of the mountains was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. And in that moment, Simone Walker knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a part of her life had just ended, lost somewhere in the deep, dark woods beyond the window. The report landed on the desk of Lead Ranger Marcus Calloway at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park's main dispatch center, like a stone dropped into a quiet pool. Missing hiker, Hazel Creek area. Adult male, 32. Infant female, 12 months. Calloway, A man whose face was a topographical map of his 30 years in the Park Service felt the familiar, unwelcome tightening in his chest. A missing person case was always a race against time, but a case with a child was a sprint toward a cliff. Every variable was magnified, every potential danger sharpened to a razor's edge. The Smokies were unforgiving to the unprepared, but they could be wantonly cruel to even the most experienced, and a 1-year-old child had no defenses at all. By 5:00 a.m. The next morning, the Fontana Marina, normally a place of leisurely tourist activity, had been transformed into a sprawling incident command post. The air, thick with the damp morning mist rising off the lake, hummed with a controlled, urgent energy. White NPS vehicles were parked in tight rows, their radios crackling with clipped professional chatter. A large topographical map of the Hazel Creek watershed, a complex spiderweb of green and brown contour lines, was spread across 2 folding tables under the yellow glow of a portable floodlight. Calloway, his expression grim, stood over it, a red marker in his hand, coordinating the initial deployment of resources. His name is Elijah Walker. Calloway briefed the assembled team leaders, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the morning chill. The group was a mix of seasoned NPS rangers, local sheriff's deputies, and volunteers from county search and rescue teams, their brightly colored jackets a stark contrast to the muted greens and grays of the surrounding wilderness. He's a school teacher from Knoxville, an avid hiker according to his wife, familiar with the park but maybe not a backcountry expert. His intended route was the Hazel Creek Trail, probably a 5 to 6 mile loop starting from the boat landing. He has his 1-year-old daughter, Leah, with him in a blue child carrier. He tapped the map. His vehicle was confirmed in the marina parking lot at 2,200 hours last night. He's been out there for at least 15 hours. The first wave of the search was a carefully orchestrated assault. 2 boat teams began methodically patrolling the northern shore of Fontana Lake, their eyes scanning the dense tree line for any sign of color, any break in the pattern of the foliage. On the other side of the lake, the first ground teams were shuttled across to the Hazel Creek trailhead. They fanned out, their mission to sweep Eli's planned route with painstaking slowness. This was not a hike. It was a forensic examination of the landscape. Their eyes were trained on the ground, searching for a single, misplaced footprint in a patch of mud, a broken branch that hung at an unnatural angle, a dropped piece of gear, a water bottle, a granola bar wrapper, anything that said human was here. The very nature of the Smokies worked against them. The forest floor was a thick, springy carpet of decaying leaves that held no prints. The canopy overhead was so dense it was like a solid green roof, rendering aerial searches from the single helicopter circling above almost useless. The pilots could see nothing but a vast, undulating sea of green. The terrain itself was a formidable adversary. The Hazel Creek watershed was a world of verticality and deception. Trails that appeared straightforward on Calloway's map became treacherous scrambles over slick, moss-covered rocks. The forest was laced with what locals called rhododendron hells, thickets of mountain laurel and rhododendrons so tangled and dense that they were nearly impenetrable, capable of swallowing a person whole just a few feet from a trail. Sound, too, was a casualty of the landscape. It didn't travel. It was absorbed by the immense green cushion of foliage. A shout for help might not carry more than 50 feet before being smothered into silence. By midday, the initial sweep of the main trail had yielded nothing, not a single sign of Eli or Leah Walker. The absence of evidence was more unnerving to Calloway than a clear sign of trouble. A man with a toddler, no matter how skilled, would leave a trail. There would be disturbances, the simple detritus of a day spent in the woods. The lack of any such trace was a silent, nagging question at the heart of the search. It was as if they had stepped off the trail and simply evaporated into the humid air. The search grid was expanded. Teams were sent up the tributary creeks, Bone Valley, Proctor, an ever-widening circle of methodical desperation. The radio chatter remained maddeningly consistent. Zone 4, clear. Nothing to report. Air asset reporting no visual on Sector 7. K9 team has lost the scent at the trailhead. Back at the ICP, Simone Walker sat on a folding chair inside a small, designated office, a forgotten cup of coffee cold in her hands. She had answered the same questions a dozen times, recounting every detail of Eli's plan, his gear, his habits. She had forwarded the photograph, the smiling, happy image that was now being printed on missing person flyers. Every time a ranger entered the room, her head would snap up, her heart lurching with a painful mix of hope and terror. And every time, the ranger's face would be a mask of professional sympathy, their words a gentle, crushing litany of nothing yet. She felt useless, a spectator at the unfolding of her own personal apocalypse. She stared at the big map on the wall, at the vast, indifferent green expanse where her family was lost. It was a monster. A beautiful, silent green monster that had swallowed her husband and child, and it was refusing to give them back. As the second day of the search bled into the third, the operation swelled in size, but the results remained the same: nothing. Calloway felt the gnawing pressure of the clock. The 72-hour window, the most critical period for finding a missing person alive, was closing fast. The media had descended on the marina, their news vans parked like vultures, their cameras capturing the grim, repetitive ballet of the search. The story of the missing father and his baby was becoming a national headline. A parent's worst nightmare played out on the evening news. But for the 100 or so people on the ground, pushing through dense brush and scrambling over slick rocks, it was not a story. It was a grueling, frustrating, and increasingly hopeless task. The mountains were keeping their secret, locked away in the deep, silent green heart of Hazel Creek. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the crackle of a radio at the incident command post broke the monotonous rhythm of negative reports. The voice belonged to a volunteer, a retired firefighter named Gary, who was part of a team assigned to a particularly brutal section of terrain, a steep, thickly wooded slope nearly a mile off the main Hazel Creek Trail. "Command, this is Grid Team 7, the voice said, strained with exertion and something else, a note of grim discovery. We've got something here, a piece of clothing." Ranger Calloway was at the radio console in an instant. "Team 7, describe the item," he commanded, his voice tight. There was a pause, filled with the sound of heavy breathing. It looks like a baby's bootie. White. It's pretty chewed up." And command, "This whole area is torn up. A lot of scat. A lot of tracks. Looks like a bear. A big one." A heavy silence fell over the command post. The half-dozen people clustered around the radio looked at each other, the same unspoken thought reflected in their eyes. A bear. It was the one possibility that had lurked in the back of everyone's mind. The apex predator in a wilderness full of them. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was home to one of the largest protected black bear populations in the eastern United States. Encounters were common. Attacks were exceedingly rare, but not unheard of. A defensive mother bear, surprised by a hiker getting too close to her cubs, could be lethally aggressive. The discovery sent a jolt through the search operation, but it was a dark, grim energy, not one of hope. Calloway dispatched a specialized team, including a wildlife biologist, to the location. He made the long, lonely walk to the small office where Simone Walker was waiting, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. He dreaded this conversation more than any other part of his job. He sat down opposite her, his hat in his hands, and delivered the news as gently as he could. He told her about the bootie, the location so far off the trail, and the undeniable signs of heavy bear activity. He didn't use the word attack. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Simone stared at him, her expression unreadable. "A bear?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "Eli. He knows about bears. He carries spray. He makes noise. He would never." Her voice trailed off, her own knowledge of her husband's meticulous nature fighting against the physical evidence the ranger was presenting. "It could have been sudden, ma'am," Calloway said softly. He could have come around a bend, surprised it. With the baby, he might have tried to stand his ground, to protect her. He searched for the right word, but there wasn't one. It's a possible scenario. The biologist's report from the site only solidified the theory. The area was a nexus of bear activity. The ground was littered with fresh scat, and the bark of several trees was shredded by claws. A nearby log had been ripped apart, its pulpy interior hollowed out by a bear searching for grubs. The booty itself was sent for analysis, but the preliminary finding was clear. The damage was consistent with being chewed by a large canine, most likely a bear. With the complete absence of any other clues, this single, grim discovery became the focal point of the entire investigation. The bear theory was seductive in its brutal logic. It explained everything. It explained why an experienced hiker would vanish without a trace. It explained why they were so far from the trail. It explained the silence. A sudden, violent encounter would have left no time for a call for help, no opportunity to leave a trail of clues. Eli and Leah hadn't simply gotten lost. They had been tragically, horrifically removed from the landscape. The narrative of the search shifted instantly. The mission was no longer one of rescue, but of recovery. The grid maps were redrawn, centering on the location of the discovery. Teams, now moving with a heavier, more somber purpose, combed the surrounding hillsides, their eyes scanning for any further signs, for human remains. They searched for another week, a grim, methodical sweep of one of the wildest corners of the park. They found more bear sign, but nothing else. The wilderness, having offered up one small mangled clue, refused to yield anything more. Eventually, the official search had to be scaled down. The resources were finite, the probability of finding anything more diminishing with each passing day. The command post was dismantled. The volunteers went home, taking with them the haunting memory of the search. The news crews packed up their cameras, their story now having a tragic, if unconfirmed, ending. Eli and Leah Walker had fallen victim to the wild, a story as old as the mountains themselves. For Ranger Calloway, it was another ghost to add to his collection, another case file that would be stamped unresolved. For Simone Walker, it was a living nightmare. She was left with an ending that was no ending at all, a story of unimaginable violence that she could neither confirm nor deny. The image of a bear, an animal her husband had taught her to respect but not fear, became a monster in her mind, the faceless villain in the story of how her world had ended. The mountains fell silent once more. But this time, the silence was filled with the echoes of a terrible, unproven story. 5 years is an eternity. It is long enough for the sharp, screaming agony of fresh grief to erode into a vast, dull landscape of permanent loss. For Simone Walker, the passage of time had not brought healing so much as a grim accommodation. She had learned to live in the country of her grief, to navigate its treacherous terrain, to breathe its thin, sorrowful air. The world had moved on, as it always does. The national news story of the missing father and daughter had faded, replaced by 1,000 other tragedies, 1,000 other headlines. The case of Eli and Leah Walker had become what she most feared. A piece of Appalachian folklore. A ghost story whispered to tourists at the Fontana Marina about the dangers that lurk just beyond the tree line. The bear theory had become the accepted truth for everyone but her. It was neat, it was tragic, and it was simple. It allowed the world to place the event in a box labeled Act of Nature and file it away. But for Simone, the theory had always felt like an ill-fitting suit. It was a story that accounted for the facts as they were known, but it did not account for the man she knew. Eli was not reckless. He was a creature of profound caution. The thought of him stumbling blindly into a confrontation with a bear felt wrong, a betrayal of the very essence of his character. He was the man who taught his 9th grade students to read the world with a critical eye, to question the easy answer, to look for the deeper truth. And in the 5 years of silence, she had tried to honor him by doing just that. She had channeled her uncertainty, the gnawing, restless energy of not knowing, into a new purpose. She had become a reluctant but powerful advocate for wilderness safety. She gave talks to hiking groups and community organizations, her voice steady, her message clear. She spoke of preparation, of knowing your limits, of the respect the wilderness demands. She used Eli's story, the public version of it, at least as a cautionary tale. It was a way to keep his memory alive, to wring some semblance of meaning from the meaningless. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the applause faded and she was alone with her thoughts, the questions remained. The what-ifs had not disappeared. They had simply burrowed deeper. She would lie awake and trace the lines of the Hazel Creek map in her mind, a map that was now seared into her memory. She would imagine him walking, Leah babbling on his back, and she would try to see the thing he had missed, the thing that had led them to that spot. So far from the trail, where the small, chewed booty was found, the outside world saw a grieving widow who had found a noble cause. But her close friends saw something else. They saw a woman conducting a quiet, 5-year investigation. She had read every book on bear behavior, every article on wilderness survival, every Park Service report on search and rescue operations. She had become an expert in a field she never wanted to enter. She knew the statistics on black bear attacks, how vanishingly rare predatory encounters were. It was almost always defensive, a surprise. And Eli did not like surprises. He was a man who planned for them. The story just didn't fit. But with no other evidence, her doubts were just feelings, ghosts of intuition rattling against the solid walls of official consensus. She was a woman haunted not just by what she had lost, but by the story she had been forced to accept. The silence of the mountains was a constant, mocking presence, a daily reminder of the truth that lay buried somewhere in their deep, green folds. A truth she was beginning to believe she would never know. The anniversaries were the hardest. Each August, a fresh wave of grief would wash over her. On what would have been Leah's 6th birthday, she had hiked a simple, safe trail on the Tennessee side of the park, a place Eli had loved. She had sat on a sun-drenched boulder overlooking a valley and tried to imagine the little girl Leah would have become. Would she have Eli's calm eyes? His easy smile? Would she love the mountains as he had? The questions were a form of self-torture, but they were all she had left of her daughter. She had accepted that she would likely live the rest of her life in this state of suspended animation, forever tethered to that one day in August 2020. The case was cold, the file gathering a thin layer of dust in a records office. The world had its story, and Simone Walker was left with a silence that was its own kind of violence, a void where the truth was supposed to be. The air at 0 feet was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and damp earth. For Caleb Jones and his friend Ben Carter, 2 geology students from NC State, this was paradise. They were on day 3 of a 5-day trek through a remote section of the park, their summer a blur of research grants and backcountry exploration. Their official task was to map granite outcrops, but their unofficial mission was to go where others didn't. On this particular afternoon in late August 2025, they had decided to leave the marked trail and bushwhack their way up an unmarked ridge that promised a commanding view of the Hazel Creek watershed. It was the kind of rugged, pathless terrain that discouraged casual hikers and thrilled them. They moved with the practiced confidence of experienced outdoorsmen, using trekking poles for balance as they scrambled over mossy boulders and pushed through thickets of mountain laurel. It was Caleb who saw it first. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against a massive, lichen-covered rock face. His gaze drifted downwards, following the line of the cliff to its base, which was obscured by a jumble of fallen rocks and dense vegetation. There, partially hidden behind a screen of overgrown rhododendron, was a shadow, a patch of darkness deeper and more absolute than the others. "Hey Ben, check that out," he said, pointing with his pole. "Looks like a cave opening." Ben joined him, squinting at the dark fissure. "Could be, or just a deep overhang." They approached cautiously, their curiosity piqued. As they got closer, the smell hit them, a musky animal scent, pungent and wild, and the ground near the opening was disturbed. There were tracks, large and clearly defined in a patch of damp earth and the remnants of old scat. "Whoa," Ben breathed, his voice low. They froze, their senses on high alert, scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. The air was still. The forest was silent, save for the distant chatter of a squirrel. There was no sound of a large animal crashing through the undergrowth, no warning woof or clacking of jaws. The den appeared to be unoccupied. Their training, their common sense, every instinct screamed at them to back away slowly and leave. But a powerful, primal curiosity, the same impulse that drives scientists and explorers, took hold. They were young, a little reckless, and the opportunity to peer into the hidden sanctuary of the park's apex predator was too tempting to resist. "Just a quick look," Caleb whispered, as if the bear might be miles away and could still overhear him. He unclipped the powerful LED flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting a sharp white circle in the gloom. Ben stood guard, his hand resting on the canister of bear spray holstered to his hip. Caleb crept forward, his heart thudding against his ribs, and angled the light into the dark opening. The beam illuminated a scene of crude domesticity. The floor of the den was a compacted mess of dirt, leaves, and dried grasses. In one corner lay a scatter of old bones, the skeletal remains of past meals, a deer's vertebrae, the jawbone of a raccoon. It was exactly what he expected to see. He swept the light across the interior, the beam glinting off the damp rock walls. And then it stopped. In the far back corner of the den, partially buried under a pile of leafy debris, was a flash of synthetic color, a vibrant, electric blue. It was a color that did not belong in this world of earth tones and decay. It was jarringly, insistently man-made. "Ben, you need to see this," Caleb said, his voice stripped of its earlier excitement and now laced with something else unease. Ben came forward, and Caleb held the light steady. They could both see it clearly now. It wasn't just a piece of trash. It was a backpack. A small child's hiking backpack, its fabric weathered and torn, its shape partially collapsed, but its form was unmistakable. The sight of it, in this place, was profoundly disturbing. A child's pack in a bear's den. The implications were immediate and chilling. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. This was no longer an exciting discovery. It was a scene. They knew the stories, the folklore of the park. They had heard the tragic tale of the teacher and his baby who had vanished 5 years ago, supposedly victims of a bear attack. The official story had placed the incident miles from here, but the sight of this small blue backpack, nestled in the back of a predator's lair, felt like a direct contradiction. It felt like a secret revealed. They backed away slowly, their eyes fixed on the dark opening. They didn't speak until they were 100 yards away, their hearts still pounding. "We have to report this," Ben said, his voice shaky. "Exactly as we found it." They took a GPS coordinate, took photos of the den's entrance from a safe distance, and then they turned and began the long, arduous hike back towards civilization. The thrill of exploration was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of their discovery. They had stumbled upon a ghost, a relic from a cold, sad story. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they were carrying a message out of the wilderness, one that had been waiting in the darkness for 5 long years. The call from the remote ranger station reached Marcus Calloway at his desk at the park headquarters. Calloway was older now, his face more deeply lined, his movements slower, but his memory was as sharp as a shard of obsidian. When the young, excited ranger on the other end of the line mentioned a blue child's backpack found in a bear den near Hazel Creek, a ghost that had been sleeping for 5 years sat up and looked Calloway straight in the eye. He didn't need to check the file. He remembered the exact shade of blue from the photo of Eli and Leah Walker, an image that had been taped above his desk for the better part of a year. "Seal the area," Calloway had ordered, his voice suddenly hard and clear. "Don't let anyone near it. I'm on my way." The discovery of the backpack was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the quiet corridors of the National Park Service. A cold case had just become scorching hot. Calloway, accompanied by a team of park law enforcement rangers, made the journey to the site. Seeing the small, weathered pack for himself, carefully extracted from the den and laid out on a sterile white tarp, was like a punch to the gut. It was a tangible link to a day of profound failure, a mystery he had long ago consigned to the archives of insoluble tragedies. But this was no longer just a Park Service matter. The potential implications were too severe. This was a possible human death investigation, and that meant calling in the heavy hitters. Within 24 hours, the case was officially handed over to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The TBI agent who arrived at the Fontana Marina ICP, now hastily re-established, was the antithesis of the world-weary Calloway. Agent David Kincaid was in his late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a lean, restless energy. He moved with an air of crisp, methodical purpose. His specialty was cold cases, puzzles that others had abandoned. He thrived on untangling knotted threads of old evidence and forgotten testimony. To Kincaid, a 5-year-old backpack found in a bear den wasn't a ghost from the past. It was a pristine starting point, a question mark demanding an answer. The handover was a formal affair, a transfer of authority from the green and gray world of the NPS to the blue and gold shield of the TBI. Kincaid listened intently as Calloway recounted the original search, his voice a low monotone as he detailed the frustrating lack of clues, the discovery of the booty, and the grim conclusion of a bear attack. Kincaid absorbed the information without comment, his expression unreadable. He was not interested in the old theories. He was interested in the new evidence. The backpack is the only thing that matters now, Kincaid stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It's the first and only piece of verifiable evidence tied directly to the victims since they disappeared. We treat it as the heart of a crime scene. The backpack, which had been carefully bagged and tagged by park rangers, was transported under armed guard to the TBI's state-of-the-art forensic lab in Knoxville. It would not be treated as found property. It would be deconstructed, molecule by molecule, by scientists who could make it tell its story. Kincaid's next move was to meet with Simone Walker. He drove to her home in Knoxville, a small, neat house with a garden full of carefully tended flowers. He found her to be exactly as Calloway had described. Intelligent, composed, but with a deep, weary sadness in her eyes. He didn't offer platitudes or false hope. He was a dealer in facts, and he laid them out for her with a calm, dispassionate precision. He told her about the discovery of the backpack, showing her a high-resolution photo of it on a tablet. Simone stared at the image of the small, torn blue pack, her composure finally cracking. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "That's it," she whispered. "That's Leah's." "I know this is difficult, Mrs. Walker," Kincaid said, his voice softening slightly. "But I need you to understand that we are treating this as a new investigation. Everything that was assumed 5 years ago is off the table. The bear theory is just that, a theory. Right now, we have no idea what happened. My only promise to you is that I will follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how long it takes." For the first time in 5 years, Simone felt a flicker of something other than grief. It was not quite hope, but a sharp, painful spark of possibility. This man, with his intense eyes and his refusal to accept the old story, was different. He wasn't trying to comfort her or manage her expectations. He was trying to find the truth. As Kincaid drove away from her house, his mind was already at work, building a framework for the investigation. The entire case rested on what the forensic lab could pull from that single weathered object. It was a long shot, a 5-year-old piece of fabric that had been sitting in a den with a wild animal. But in Kincaid's experience, cold cases were never solved with a single, dramatic breakthrough. They were solved by the patient, relentless accumulation of small, forgotten details. And the small blue backpack was the first detail to emerge from the silence in half a decade. The case of Eli and Leah Walker was no longer a tragedy to be mourned. It was a puzzle to be solved. The TBI Forensic Science Center in Knoxville was a sterile world of controlled air, humming machinery, and the quiet, intense focus of people who spoke the language of evidence. The blue backpack arrived at the lab and was assigned to Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic chemist whose specialty was material analysis and trace evidence. Thorne was a man who believed every object told a story, and his job was to be its translator. He began his work not with a scalpel, but with a camera, documenting every inch of the weathered pack, every tear, every stain, every puncture mark, creating a comprehensive visual record before the physical examination even began. The first phase of the analysis confirmed what was already obvious. The exterior of the backpack showed clear signs of animal damage. Thorne identified a series of long, parallel tears in the nylon fabric, consistent with the raking motion of a bear's claws. He swabbed the edges of several puncture marks and, under a microscope, found microscopic fragments of tooth enamel. DNA analysis of saliva residue from these areas came back with a positive match for Ursus americanus, the American black bear. The initial findings seemed to bolster the 5-year-old theory. The pack had, at some point, been in the possession of a bear. But Dr. Thorne was a man of details, and it was in the anomalies that he knew the real story was often found. As he continued his meticulous examination, he flagged 2 things that didn't fit the bear attack narrative. The first was a small, neat hole located in the reinforced base of the pack, an area made of thick, semi-rigid ballistic nylon. Unlike the ragged tears and punctures on the upper portion, this hole was clean, almost surgical. It was no more than a ½ inch in diameter, a perfect puncture. When he examined it under a high-powered digital microscope, he saw that the nylon fibers around the hole were not torn, but sheared. This was not the work of a conical tooth. This was damage made by a sharp, narrow, flat-sided metal object. It was a stab, not a bite. The second anomaly was discovered deep within the pack itself. One of the small, zippered side pockets had remained sealed, its zipper fused shut by years of corrosion and grime. Thorne's team carefully cut the pocket open. Inside, it was mostly empty, save for a compacted cake of dirt and old leaves that had likely filtered in through the seams over the years. This was the kind of mundane debris usually discarded, but Thorne's protocol was to analyze everything. He took a sample of the soil residue and placed it in the lab's gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, a machine capable of identifying the precise chemical composition of a substance. He was not looking for anything specific, simply running a standard analysis for any foreign contaminants. As the machine completed its run, a series of peaks appeared on his monitor. Most were expected, common silicates, organic compounds from decaying plant matter. But one peak stood out, a chemical signature he did not immediately recognize. He ran it against the lab's extensive chemical library. The result that came back made him sit up straight in his chair. The compound was identified as hexazenone, a powerful, broad-spectrum herbicide. Thorne ran a cross-reference. Hexazenone was not an ingredient in any commercially available weed killer sold to the public. Its use was highly restricted, primarily for industrial forestry and right-of-way management. And, as a footnote in the database mentioned, it was also known to be a chemical of choice for a very specific type of criminal, high-level American ginseng poachers. This was the pivot. This single, microscopic trace of a chemical found in a sealed pocket changed everything. A bear might chew on a backpack. A bear does not carry restricted-use herbicides. Thorne compiled his findings into a formal report, his language precise and devoid of speculation. He concluded with 2 clear, irrefutable points. 1, the backpack exhibited damage from 2 distinct sources: a bear and a sharp manufactured metal object, 2 pawn. The backpack contained trace residues of a restricted chemical strongly associated with illicit ginseng cultivation. When the report landed on Agent Kincaid's desk, he read it twice, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. The 5-year-old story had just been obliterated by science. The clean puncture wound in the base of the pack was the mark of a tool. The herbicide was the mark of a motive, This was no longer a tragic story of a man and his daughter being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was the story of a man and his daughter stumbling upon something they were never meant to see. Eli Walker hadn't been the victim of a random act of nature. He had been a witness. The focus of the investigation shifted with tectonic force. Kincaid was no longer hunting for a bear. He was hunting for a poacher. The TBI conference room was stark and institutional, a world away from the wild green chaos of the Smoky Mountains. On a large whiteboard, Agent Kincaid had written a single word in bold red letters: hexazinone. For him, this was the Rosetta Stone of the entire case. The herbicide was the key that unlocked a hidden world operating within the park, a world of secrecy, high stakes, and potential violence. American ginseng, Kincaid began, addressing a small, hand-picked team of investigators and an analyst from the U.S. Forest Service. For most people, it's something you see in a health food store. In Appalachia, for a certain subset of the population, it's gold. Mature, wild roots can fetch over $1,000 a pound on the Asian market. We're not talking about a guy digging up a few plants for pocket money. We're talking about sophisticated, multi-acre, semi-wild cultivation sites hidden deep in the backcountry. The Forest Service analyst elaborated. The big operators, the ones who are serious, don't just harvest, they cultivate. They find a perfect north-facing slope with the right soil and canopy cover, and they create a secret farm. The biggest challenge is competition from other native plants. That's where the herbicide comes in. They use something powerful like hexazinone to create a dead zone around their patch, killing everything but the ginseng. It's an ecological disaster, but it guarantees a pure, high-yield crop worth hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of dollars. The theory began to crystallize in the room. Eli Walker, an inquisitive man with a love for botany, leaves the main trail. He's not recklessly lost, he's exploring. He ventures up a remote hollow in the Hazel Creek area and stumbles upon one of these secret farms. He finds not just a few plants, but a multi-million-dollar illegal enterprise, and the owners are there. These operations are guarded, Kincaid continued, his voice low and intense. The people running them are not simple woodsmen. They are organized criminals protecting a massive, untaxed, cash-based income. They are paranoid, secretive, and potentially violent. A schoolteacher from Knoxville with a baby on his back, snapping photos with his phone, is the last person on earth they want to see. The focus of the investigation shifted from forensic science to pure detective work. Kincaid's mission was to find a ghost, a poacher active in the Hazel Creek area in August of 2020. He began a deep dive into the park's archives, pulling every file, every citation, every field report related to poaching in the years leading up to the disappearance. It was a mountain of paperwork, a litany of minor infractions: illegal fishing, camping without a permit, harvesting mushrooms out of season. But Kincaid was looking for a pattern, for names that appeared more than once, for individuals known to have the skills and temperament for a large-scale operation. He created a matrix on his whiteboard, cross-referencing names of known offenders with locations. The Hazel Creek area was a hotspot. Its remoteness made it ideal for illicit activities. Several names popped up, but most were small-time operators, men caught with a few roots in their pockets, hardly the masterminds of a sophisticated chemical-based farm. Kincaid needed something more. He needed to find the source of the hexazinone. This was the needle in the haystack. The herbicide was sold through restricted agricultural suppliers. Tracing a specific sale from 5 years ago back to an individual paying in cash would be nearly impossible. But Kincaid's team caught a break. An analyst found a 5-year-old anonymous tip that had been logged by a park dispatcher and forgotten. The caller, who had refused to give his name, had reported seeing 2 men in an old Ford truck unloading suspicious-looking canisters near a remote access point by Fontana Dam. The caller had described the men and their vehicle and had mentioned that he suspected they were sanging, a local term for ginseng poaching. The tip had been deemed too vague to act on at the time. Kincaid pulled the file. The date of the tip was July 28, 2020, less than 3 weeks before Eli and Leah Walker disappeared. The description of the men and the truck, while generic, provided a new avenue. Kincaid requested all available records from the park's network of remote wildlife trail cameras for that time period. It was a painstaking process, sifting through tens of thousands of images of deer, bears, and the occasional hiker. After 2 solid days of review, an analyst found it, a single, blurry, time-stamped image from a camera positioned on a service road near Fontana Dam. The photo, taken late in the evening on August 23, 2020, the day after Eli was last seen, showed an old, beat-up, dark-colored Ford pickup truck leaving the park. It was impossible to make out the license plate or the faces of the 2 occupants, but the truck was a match for the anonymous tip. It was circumstantial, a whisper of a lead, but it was the first piece of evidence that placed a potential suspect at the scene at the right time. The poacher was no longer a ghost. He now had a getaway vehicle. The blurry image of the Ford truck became the cornerstone of Agent Kincaid's investigation. It was a ghost, but a ghost with a shape. He ran the description through every law enforcement database in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, cross-referencing it with the names from his list of known park offenders. The search generated dozens of potential hits, a frustratingly long list of men who owned old Ford trucks and had a history of minor run-ins with the law. Kincaid began the slow, methodical work of elimination, digging into the lives of each man on the list, looking for connections, for anything that might tie them to a high-level poaching operation. His focus narrowed on a pair of brothers from a rural, impoverished county in North Carolina, just across the park's southern border, Silas and Caleb Thorne. Their names had appeared several times in park records over the years. Minor infractions, always. A warning for an illegal campfire in 2017. A small fine for being in a closed area in 2018. They were skilled woodsmen, known to the local rangers as men who moved through the forest with an almost supernatural quietness. They were fiercely private, intensely protective of their family land, and deeply suspicious of any form of government authority. They fit the profile. The file on the Thorne brothers was thin, but one detail snagged Kincaid's attention. In 2019, a ranger had stopped them and, during a consensual search of their truck, found several specialized digging tools. The ranger, suspecting they were poaching, had photographed the tools before issuing a warning. The tool was a sang hoe, a small, heavy-duty mattock designed specifically for digging in the hard, rocky soil where ginseng grows. The photograph was still in the file. The puncture wound in Leah's backpack had been made by a sharp, narrow, flat-sided metal object. The blade of the sang hoe was a perfect potential match. Kincaid dispatched 2 agents to do a quiet background check on the Thornes. They were to be discreet, talking to old neighbors, checking public records, building a picture of their lives without alerting the brothers themselves. The agents returned a week later with a crucial piece of information. The Thorne brothers, who had lived in the same family home for their entire lives, had abruptly sold their property and moved in the fall of 2020, just 2 months after Eli and Leah Walker had disappeared. There was no clear reason for the move. They had no new jobs lined up, no family to follow. They had simply cashed out and vanished from the area. It was another circumstantial piece, but it was a powerful one. It felt less like a relocation and more like a flight. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place from an unexpected source. Kincaid's team had been trying to trace the source of the hexazenone, a task that had seemed impossible. But one of his analysts, a young, tenacious woman named Carter, had an idea. Instead of trying to trace the sale, she decided to trace the container. She compiled a list of all agricultural suppliers within a 300-mile radius that were licensed to sell the restricted herbicide. She then began calling them, one by one, with a simple, fabricated story. She claimed to be from an environmental safety group doing a study on the disposal of old chemical containers. She asked if they had any records of customers reporting lost or stolen canisters around the summer of 2020. It was a shot in the dark, a tedious, long-shot gamble. On the 37th call, she hit gold. A small, family-run supplier in rural Georgia remembered something. The owner said that in late 2020, He had been contacted by a man, Silas Thorne, who claimed that a canister of herbicide he had purchased for fence line clearing on his property had been stolen from the back of his truck. Thorne had wanted to know if he was liable. The supplier remembered the name because Thorne had paid in cash and seemed unusually agitated. He had kept a record of the call for his own liability purposes. Kincaid now had a direct link. The Thorne brothers were connected to the location through their history, to the weapon through their tools, to the motive through their association with sanging, and now to the specific chemical found in the backpack. The web of circumstantial evidence was becoming a cage. He finally had enough to get a search warrant and, more importantly, enough to construct a detailed, plausible theory of the crime. The ghosts he had been hunting now had names: Silas and Caleb Thorne. The conference room was silent as Agent Kincaid stood before the whiteboard. The scattered pieces of the puzzle, the backpack, the herbicide, the sang-ho, the anonymous tip, the blurry photo, the brothers' sudden move had been assembled into a single, terrifying image. He was ready to present the new narrative, a story born from 5 years of silence and 6 weeks of relentless investigation. In the room were his TBI team, Lead Ranger Marcus Calloway, and, at Kincaid's insistence, Simone Walker. He believed she had a right to hear it first, to understand the path the investigation was now on. For 5 years, Kincaid began, his voice steady and measured. We have operated under the assumption of a tragic accident. The bear theory. It was logical. It fit the little evidence we had, and it provided a form of closure. Today, we leave that theory behind. The evidence does not point to an animal. It points to Silas and Caleb Thorne. He turned to the board and began to walk them through the reconstructed timeline, a narrative woven from evidence, profiling, and logical inference. August 2020. Eli Walker takes his daughter, Leah, for a day hike into Hazel Creek. He is a teacher, a naturalist, a man interested in the world around him. He is not the type to stick rigidly to a path if something interesting catches his eye. He's not lost, he's exploring. Kincaid pointed to a topographical map of Hazel Creek, circling a remote, steep-walled hollow several miles from the main trail. We believe he came upon this area. A perfect north-facing slope, old-growth canopy, ideal conditions for a ginseng patch. But this wasn't just a patch. Based on the chemical evidence, we believe the Thorne brothers were cultivating a massive, multi-acre illegal farm in this hollow, a crop potentially worth millions. And on that day they were there, tending to their investment. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Simone Walker sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Kincaid. What happens next is speculation, Kincaid admitted, but it is informed speculation. Eli, being the open and friendly man he was, likely did not perceive them as a threat. He may have been curious, asked what they were doing. He had a phone. He had taken a picture of his daughter earlier that day. It's highly probable that he took a picture of this unusual agricultural site or of the brothers themselves, and that was the fatal mistake. Silas and Caleb Thorne are not just farmers. They are criminals guarding a fortune. They are paranoid, and they cannot afford to be identified. An argument breaks out. It starts with threats, telling Eli to get out, to delete the photos. But it escalates. They are armed with their tools. One of them, likely Silas, the older and more dominant brother, strikes Eli with his sang-ho. The attack is sudden and brutal. Kincaid paused, his gaze meeting Simone's. The puncture in the base of Leah's backpack. It wasn't an accident. We believe Eli turned to shield his daughter as the blow came, and the sharp edge of the tool went through the pack. The trauma to Eli would have been severe, likely fatal. He let the horrifying image hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Now, they have a choice. They have murdered a man, a father with a baby. They panic. They can't leave the bodies here, at the site of their operation. So they make a decision. They have to hide them. They take Eli and Leah, and they bury them. A shallow, hasty grave, somewhere they believe no one will ever look. They leave the backpack behind in their haste, perhaps torn off during the struggle. Their crime, they think, is hidden. But then, nature intervenes. A bear, attracted by the scent, finds the backpack. It chews on it, drags it for some distance, and eventually takes it back to its den. This single act of a wild animal creates the perfect cover story. When the booty is found, everyone, including law enforcement, jumps to the most logical conclusion: a bear attack. The Thorne brothers' crime is not only hidden, it's misattributed to a random act of nature. They get away clean. A few months later, they sell their land and disappear, leaving a cold trail and a false narrative. Kincaid finally fell silent. The new theory was complete. It was a story of greed, panic, and horrific violence, a world away from the simple tragedy of a man versus nature. Ranger Calloway stared at the board, his face pale, the weight of the original investigation's flawed conclusion settling on him. Simone Walker did not cry. A strange, cold calm had settled over her. The story was infinitely more painful than the one she had lived with for 5 years, but it had something the other story lacked. It had the ring of truth. It accounted for the man she knew, his curiosity, his trusting nature. And it provided something she had long ago given up on: a target for her anger, a human face to her grief. "So what now?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. Kincaid looked at her, his expression resolute. "Now," he said, "we go back to Hazel Creek. But we're not looking for a victim of a bear attack. We are conducting a forensic search for a clandestine grave. We are going to find your husband and your daughter." The return to Hazel Creek was a fundamentally different operation from the one conducted 5 years prior. The sprawling, desperate energy of the original search was gone, replaced by the cold, precise focus of a forensic investigation. Agent Kincaid did not assemble a large team of volunteers. He handpicked a small, elite crew: 2 TBI forensic technicians, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee, and a geophysicist who specialized in ground-penetrating radar, GPR. Ranger Calloway insisted on accompanying them, not as a leader, but as an observer, a man needing to see the final chapter of a story that had haunted him for years. Their destination was not the area where the booty or the backpack had been found. Their destination was the remote, steep-walled hollow that Kincaid's analysis had identified as the probable location of the illegal ginseng farm. Getting there was an ordeal in itself, requiring a boat ride, a long hike on the main trail, and then a grueling multi-hour bushwhack up a steep, thickly vegetated slope. They were entering the same terrain the Thorne brothers would have used, a place chosen specifically for its inaccessibility. The hollow was a natural amphitheater of green, walled in by steep cliffs and choked with ancient trees. The air was cool and damp, the ground a thick carpet of moss and decaying leaves. It felt secret, isolated, a world unto itself. The GPR specialist, a man named Dr. Evans, began to set up his equipment. The device looked like a futuristic lawnmower, a small console mounted on wheels with an antenna that sent electromagnetic pulses into the ground. It could detect anomalies in the soil composition disturbances, buried objects, voids, without turning a single spadeful of earth. As Evans prepared, the forensic technicians began a systematic surface search of the hollow, moving in a slow, disciplined line. They were looking for any lingering signs of the poaching operation, old footprints, discarded tools, or traces of the herbicide. Within an hour, they found it. Tucked away under a rock overhang was a small, rusted can of smokeless tobacco and, more significantly, a tattered piece of black plastic sheeting, the kind often used to suppress weeds or carry supplies. It was proof that people had been here. Using this remote place for their own purposes, Dr. Evans began his work, pushing the GPR unit in a series of overlapping parallel lines, a process as methodical and tedious as mowing a football field. His eyes were fixed on the laptop screen mounted on the console, which displayed a real-time cross-sectional view of the soil beneath him. For hours, the screen showed nothing but the expected layers of topsoil, clay, and rock. The hollow was silent save for the whirring of the GPR's electronics and the distant call of a raven. Kincaid and Calloway watched, the tension mounting with each pass. This was the crux of the entire investigation. Kincaid's theory was built on a chain of logic and circumstantial evidence, but this was the moment it would either be proven or fall apart. If there was no grave here, his case against the Thorne brothers would remain a compelling story, but a story without the irrefutable proof of a body. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the hollow, Dr. Evans stopped. He stared at his screen, then slowly backed the GPR unit up and made another pass over the same section of ground. He knelt, pointing at the screen. "Agent Kincaid," he said, his voice quiet. "I've got something." Kincaid and the others crowded around. On the screen, amidst the uniform horizontal bands of natural soil strata, was a distinct, unmistakable anomaly. About 4 feet down, the lines were broken, jumbled, indicating a pit that had been dug and refilled. Within that disturbed area was a denser, oblong shape. "The soil density is inconsistent with the surrounding earth," Evans explained, tracing the shape with his finger. "And this signature here, it's consistent with the presence of bone. The size and shape. It's a grave. A clandestine grave." A profound, somber silence fell over the team. Kincaid looked at Calloway, whose face was a mixture of vindication and deep sorrow. The theory was no longer a theory. The ghost story had a location. Kincaid nodded to the forensic technicians. "Let's begin," he said. The second search was over. The recovery was about to begin. The excavation was a slow, sacred, and heartbreaking process. It was not a digging. It was an archaeological peel, removing layers of earth with the painstaking care of a surgeon. The forensic technicians traded their shovels for trowels and brushes. The atmosphere in the hollow shifted from one of tense anticipation to one of profound reverence. Every person on the team understood they were on the verge of uncovering not just evidence, but the final resting place of a father and his child. First, they uncovered the tattered remnants of clothing, the durable fabric of hiking pants, the faded cotton of a man's t-shirt. Then, the first human bone came into view. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Alistair Finch, took over, his movements deft and respectful. Working with dental brushes and bamboo picks, he slowly exposed the skeletal remains. The story of Eli Walker's final moments began to tell itself in the language of bone. The remains were mostly intact, positioned in a shallow grave. Dr. Finch's examination quickly revealed the cause of death. He pointed to a large, depressed fracture on the temporal bone of the skull. "This is the primary injury," he explained in a low voice, his words directed at Kincaid's recording device. "Massive blunt force trauma, delivered with extreme force from the side." Then, he gently turned one of the ribs, exposing a small, neat notch in the bone. "And this," he said, indicating the mark, "is a puncture wound." The tool penetrated the chest cavity. The dimensions are consistent with the Sang-Ho blade from your file. The evidence was a perfect, horrifying match for Kincaid's theory. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was yet to come. Lying next to the adult skeleton, sheltered within the curve of its arms as if in a final, protective embrace, were the tiny, delicate bones of a 1-year-old child, Leah. There were no signs of trauma on her remains. Her death, Dr. Finch concluded, was likely due to exposure or suffocation after being buried. The image was so devastating that several of the hardened technicians had to turn away, their professional composure shattered. The truth, laid bare in the earth of Hazel Creek, was more brutal than any of them had imagined. Eli Walker had died fighting, trying to shield his daughter until the very end. The Thorne brothers, in their panic, had buried them together. They had covered their crime with a few feet of dirt and walked away, leaving a father and his baby to the silence of the forest. As the team meticulously documented and prepared the remains for transport, Ranger Calloway stood apart, leaning against an ancient oak tree at the edge of the hollow. He looked smaller, older, the weight of 5 years pressing down on him. He had been so certain of the bear theory, so convinced by the logic of the wild. But the wild had been a red herring. The monster in this story had been human all along. He had looked Simone Walker in the eye and presented her with a story that, while tragic, had absolved humanity of the crime. He saw now that in doing so, he had inadvertently helped the killers conceal their deed. It was a professional failure that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his days. With the bodies of Eli and Leah Walker recovered, the cause of death unequivocally confirmed, and the murder weapon all but identified, Kincaid's circumstantial case had transformed into an ironclad prosecution. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. He made a call from his satellite phone, his voice cold and hard. "We have them," he said. "It's confirmed. Move in. Bring the brothers in." The truth had been unearthed from the deep, dark soil of the mountains. Now, it was time for justice. The arrest of Silas and Caleb Thorne was swift and quiet. 2 unmarked TBI vehicles rolled up the long, dusty driveway to their secluded property in the North Carolina foothills just as dawn was breaking. There was no resistance. The brothers, now in their late 40s and early 50s, seemed to have been waiting for this day for 5 years, a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. They were arrested for parole violations on a past charge, a legal maneuver to get them into custody while Kincaid prepared the murder charges. Agent Kincaid chose to interrogate the younger brother, Caleb, first. He was the weaker of the two, his eyes holding a haunted, twitchy nervousness that Silas's cold, hard stare lacked. They sat in a small, gray, windowless room at the TBI field office. Kincaid didn't threaten or yell. He simply laid out the truth on the metal table between them. He placed a series of glossy 8x10 photographs on the table. The first was of the blue backpack. The second was a microscopic image of the hexazenone compound. The third was a photo of the Sang-Ho from their 2019 file. The fourth was a high-resolution image of the notch it had left in Eli Walker's rib. The final photograph was of the excavation site, showing the 2 skeletons nestled together in the earth. Caleb Thorne stared at the final photograph, and the dam of his 5-year silence broke. A choked sob escaped his lips, and he covered his face with his hands, his body shaking. "He just wouldn't leave," Caleb whispered, his voice a torrent of panicked confession. "We told him to get out, that he was trespassing. But he was all friendly-like, asking questions, talking about the plants. He took out his phone. Silas thought he was taking our picture. He panicked. He recounted the entire, sordid story. The argument. Silas, in a fit of rage, swinging the Sang-Ho. The horrifying realization of what they had done. The baby, wailing in her carrier next to her fallen father. "We didn't know what to do," Caleb cried, tears streaming down his face. "We thought our lives were over. Silas said we had to hide them, that no one would ever find them up there. He said the bears would take care of any evidence. He explained how they had buried them, how they had fled the park in the dead of night, how they had lived every single day since then in a state of suffocating fear, waiting for the knock on the door that had finally come. Confronted with the undeniable truth, the younger brother confessed to everything. Silas, presented with his brother's confession, remained silent, his face a mask of cold fury. But it didn't matter. Kincaid had everything he needed. The final act belonged to Simone Walker. Kincaid met her at her home, the same house he had visited weeks earlier. He sat with her at her kitchen table and, with a quiet, gentle gravity, told her everything. He told her they had found Eli and Leah. He told her how they had been found together, how Eli had tried to protect their daughter to the very end. And he told her that the men responsible were in custody and had confessed. Simone listened without interruption, her face a canvas of complex emotions, sorrow, rage, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. The truth was 1,000 times more painful than the story of a wild animal, a story of senseless, random nature. This was a story of human greed and cruelty, a story that had a villain, a choice, a moment of terrible, needless violence. But it was the truth, the not knowing. The ghost that had haunted her for 5 years was finally gone, replaced by a terrible certainty. When Kincaid finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she nodded. A single, slow gesture of acceptance. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for bringing them home." The silence of the Great Smoky Mountains had finally been broken. For Simone Walker, the path ahead was not one of closure, a wound that deep could never truly close. But it was, for the first time in 5 long years, a path that was not shrouded in the fog of uncertainty. Justice would be a slow, arduous process, a journey through courtrooms and testimony, but it was a journey that could now begin. The long, slow path to justice had been cleared, paved by a single backpack, a trace of poison, and the relentless pursuit of a truth that had been buried in the lonely heart of the mountains.